Okay, so have you ever heard of this thing, barefoot cognition?
Hmm.
It's like this idea about approaching things, with like a sense of immediacy. It's about ditching those rigid processes.
Ah, okay.
And it's kind of like, I guess the name suggests, like feeling the earth beneath your feet, that direct connection. But like with anything, gotta look at both sides, right?
Right. Yeah. You got to look at both sides. While barefoot cognition can really champion agility and adaptability,
Yay.
it can also kind of expose you to certain vulnerabilities.
Right.
The lack of structure, for instance, that can be a double-edged sword.
Yeah, that's what caught my eye in these sources too. Like
Yeah.
initially ditching the rule book, it sounds so liberating, so freeing, but then you start to think about the potential for more mistakes. How do we find that balance, would you say?
Well, think of it like this,
Mm.
structure, even if it feels restrictive sometimes, it acts as a safety net.
Okay, yeah.
Take the financial markets, for example.
Mm.
Algorithmic trading, often driven by barefoot principles of reacting like instantaneously to market shifts,
Yep.
has been known to trigger uh, flash crashes
Right.
due to the absence of safeguards.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in a
Yeah.
work setting then, would that translate to having like a minimum viable structure or something, even within a barefoot approach?
Precisely. You
Yeah.
need just enough guidelines to avoid chaos, especially when you're dealing with multiple people involved.
Right.
It's like, jazz improvisation, right?
Yeah.
You have the freedom, but it works because everyone understands the underlying harmony and rhythm.
Ah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that got me thinking was this whole idea of relying heavily on intuition.
Hmm.
The sources seem to be kind of cautioning against that, right? Like,
Yeah.
be careful.
Yes, because while intuition is valuable, over-reliance on it can be problematic.
Yeah.
You become susceptible to cognitive biases,
Right.
particularly the what we call the availability heuristic.
Yeah.
This is where you make decisions based on the information that's like most easily comes to mind, right?
Uh-huh.
Even if it's not the most relevant or accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It actually reminds me of this situation in one of the articles that you sent about this company, and they went all in on this new product based solely on the CEO's gut feeling. And they completely ignored like all the market research data suggesting a different approach.
Oh, wow.
And let's just say it didn't end well for them.
Yeah, that's a classic example of how unchecked intuition can backfire. Data and analytical thinking are crucial
Yeah.
for sound decision making, even within a barefoot framework.
So for like our listener, if they're considering trying out this barefoot approach in their work, how can they make sure they're not falling prey to these biases? Like, are there any practical tips?
Well, one technique is to consciously seek out diverse viewpoints
Okay, yeah.
and data points that might challenge your initial assumptions. It's about forcing yourself to step outside of your intuitive comfort zone.
That's great. That's a great tip. Now, shifting gears a bit, I was curious about how barefoot cognition scales in larger organizations. The sources seem to hint at some challenges there.
Absolutely. Imagine trying to coordinate a large team without any formalized processes or documentation.
Right.
It quickly becomes overwhelming and inefficient.
But isn't some level of like risk-taking essential for innovation? Like, how do we balance that need with the need for structure,
Yeah.
especially in a barefoot environment?
That's a key question.
Yeah.
One way to navigate this is by implementing a system of what we call structured experimentation. You designate specific areas or projects you see where teams can operate with more barefoot freedom while still maintaining clear boundaries and reporting mechanisms.
That sounds like a very practical way to incorporate the best of both worlds.
Exactly. It allows you to foster a culture of innovation and adaptability without sacrificing overall organizational efficiency.
Now, speaking of adaptability, one thing that struck me as a bit ironic was the potential for barefoot cognition to lead to resistance to change.
Oh, interesting.
How does that work?
It might seem counterintuitive, but it comes down to the perception of complexity. Someone operating with a barefoot mindset might view new tools or processes as unnecessary burdens that disrupt their flow.
Ah, I see. It's like someone who's used to running barefoot resisting the idea of wearing running shoes, even if they could potentially enhance their performance.
Exactly. And this can be especially problematic in today's rapidly evolving work landscape,
Right.
where embracing new technologies and methodologies is crucial for staying ahead.
So for a listener, what would you suggest as a way to mitigate this potential resistance?
Transparent communication is key. and demonstrating the value of these new tools. Instead of framing them as constraints, position them as enablers that can amplify their barefoot agility and effectiveness.
Makes sense. Now, I'm also kind of curious about the impact on, well, individual well-being. The sources mention the risk of burnout, right? Like,
Yes.
is that a real concern?
And this is a crucial consideration.
Mm-hmm.
The constant responsiveness and engagement that barefoot cognition encourages can easily lead to overwork and exhaustion, if not managed carefully.
One of the studies that you shared actually mentioned the Zeigarnik effect, where unfinished tasks, they tend to stay in our minds and create like this mental tension.
Right.
In a barefoot environment with its emphasis on constant engagement, wouldn't that like amplify this effect?
Absolutely. That's why setting boundaries and prioritizing self-care are paramount, even within a barefoot framework.
Right.
Otherwise, you risk sacrificing long-term sustainability for short-term gains.
So for our listener, what are like some practical strategies they could implement to avoid burning out?
One effective approach is what's called the Pomodoro technique. It involves working in focused bursts, say 25 minutes, followed by short breaks. This helps maintain focus and prevents mental fatigue.
That's great. And what about documentation? I know the idea is to like be agile and ditch the paperwork, but surely there's a need for some record keeping, right?
You're right. While excessive documentation can stifle agility, having some form of record keeping, even if it's minimal, is essential. Think of it as a breadcrumb trail that helps you track progress, make informed decisions, and maintain accountability.
All right, so we've talked about the potential downsides of lack of structure, over-reliance on intuition, the challenges of scaling, resistance to change, the risk of burnout, and the importance of documentation. Is there anything else we should be aware of before we move on?
There is one more crucial point we need to address. It's the risk of, well, diminished accountability and transparency when things are done in a less structured, less documented way.
Yeah, that makes sense. If everything's based on intuition and just like verbal agreements, things could easily slip through the cracks.
Exactly. In one of your sources, there was this case study about a tech startup that initially thrived on a barefoot approach.
Yeah.
They were super agile, able to pivot quickly, respond to market changes in real time.
Wow, sounds ideal.
But as they grew, this lack of formal processes, it started to create problems. Responsibilities became unclear. Decisions were made without proper documentation. And, well, it ultimately led to internal conflicts and a decline in performance.
So how can we mitigate that risk? Is it a matter of just finding the right documentation tools, or is it more about establishing like a culture of accountability, even within a barefoot framework?
It's a bit of both, actually. You need tools that support agility and don't feel like a burden, maybe like lightweight project management platforms or even shared digital notes that everyone can access. But more importantly, it's about fostering a shared understanding that accountability is everyone's responsibility, not just something enforced by rigid processes.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like the difference between being told to do something and actually understanding why it's important to do it.
Precisely. When people understand the why behind accountability, they're more likely to embrace it, even in a less structured environment.
This has been such an insightful deep dive so far. We've explored the concept of barefoot cognition. We've talked about the potential benefits and also the pitfalls to watch out for. It seems like the key takeaway here is that it's not about blindly ditching all structure and process, but rather about finding that sweet spot, right, between agility and accountability. Intuition and analysis. What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree. Barefoot cognition isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a mindset, a set of principles that you can adapt to your specific context and needs. And it's crucial to be mindful of the potential downsides that we've discussed and to implement strategies to mitigate those risks.
So for our listener who's intrigued by this concept and wants to experiment with incorporating some of these barefoot principles into their work, what would be your top piece of advice?
Well, I'd suggest starting by, identifying areas where a barefoot approach might be most beneficial.
Okay.
Maybe it's a project that requires rapid iteration, a team that's bogged down by bureaucracy, or a task that demands, creative problem solving.
And once they've identified those areas, what's the next step?
It's important to establish clear boundaries and expectations. Even within a barefoot framework, you need some, ground rules. Define the scope of the experiment, the roles and responsibilities, and the key metrics for success.
So it's kind of like creating a mini sandbox where you can play with barefoot principles without like disrupting the entire ecosystem.
That's a great analogy. It allows you to test the waters, learn from the experience, and gradually integrate those principles into other areas of your work as you gain confidence.
Now, we talked earlier about the importance of balancing intuition with data and analysis. How can someone who's used to relying heavily on their gut feeling, like, how can they make that shift?
One practical tip is to make it a habit to question your assumptions.
Okay.
Whenever you feel a strong intuitive pull towards a particular decision, just pause and ask yourself, what data do I have to support this? Or what other perspectives am I missing?
I like that. It's about consciously challenging your own biases and seeking out like evidence-based insights.
Exactly. Another helpful technique is to create a decision journal. Every time you make a significant decision, jot down your rationale, the factors you considered, the expected outcome. This can help you track your decision-making process over time and identify any patterns or biases that might be emerging.
That's a great idea. It's like having like a personal feedback loop that helps you refine your decision-making skills.
Precisely. Now, in terms of scaling Barefoot Cognition to larger organizations, one of the key challenges we discussed was this potential for, chaos and a lack of coordination.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how to address that?
Well, I think the idea of structured experimentation that you mentioned earlier is a great starting point. But beyond that, I also think it's crucial to have strong communication channels and a culture that values transparency and feedback.
I couldn't agree more. In a barefoot environment where things are constantly evolving, communication becomes even more crucial. Regular check-ins, open forums for discussion, and tools that facilitate real-time collaboration. These can all help ensure that everyone's on the same page.
And what about the risk of burnout, which we touched upon earlier? How can individuals and organizations create a sustainable barefoot work culture?
One crucial aspect is to clearly define boundaries and expectations around work hours and availability. Just because you're embracing a more agile and responsive approach doesn't mean you need to be on 24/7.
Right. It's about finding ways to disconnect and recharge even within a barefoot framework. What are some practical strategies that that individuals can implement?
One effective technique is to schedule digital detox periods where you completely disconnect from all electronic devices
Interesting.
for a set period of time. Could be for a few hours each evening, a full day each week, or even a longer retreat a few times a year.
That sounds like a great way to reset and recharge. And what about organizations? How can they like foster a culture that supports employee well-being?
Well, one important step is to provide training and resources on stress management, mindfulness, and work-life balance. Organizations can also implement policies that encourage employees to take breaks, prioritize their well-being, and disconnect from work outside of work hours.
This brings us back to the importance of documentation. Even within a barefoot environment, how can we strike that balance between agility and accountability when it comes to record keeping?
The key is to find tools and methods that support documentation without feeling burdensome or restrictive. This could involve using lightweight project management software, shared digital notebooks, or even simply jotting down key decisions and action items during meetings.
I like that idea of keeping it simple and focusing on the essentials. It's about capturing the information that's truly valuable without getting, bogged down in unnecessary paperwork.
Exactly. The goal is to create a breadcrumb trail that provides enough context and accountability without stifling the agility and flow of the barefoot approach.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into barefoot cognition, it seems like the biggest takeaway for our listener is that it's not about throwing out all the rules and embracing chaos, right?
Right.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that delicate balance between structure and freedom, intuition and analysis, responsiveness and sustainability. It's about being mindful, intentional, and constantly adapting based on the specific context and challenges that, you're
Beautifully put.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the importance of staying curious and open to new ideas, even within a barefoot framework. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Absolutely. One of the biggest dangers of any system, even one that's designed to be, flexible and adaptable, is that it can become rigid and dogmatic over time.
Hmm.
We get so comfortable with what we know that we resist anything that challenges our existing paradigms.
So that makes sense. It's like getting stuck in a rut, even if that rut initially felt like a path to freedom.
Exactly. And that's why cultivating a mindset of continuous learning and exploration is so crucial. It's about actively seeking out new information, perspectives, and methodologies that can help you evolve your barefoot approach and avoid getting stagnant.
So for our listener who's excited about embracing a more barefoot way of working and thinking, what would be your advice on how to cultivate that sense of curiosity and openness?
One practical tip is to make it a habit to expose yourself to diverse sources of information.
Okay.
Read books and articles outside of your usual areas of interest. Attend conferences and workshops that challenge your existing knowledge and assumptions.
It's about stepping outside of your intellectual comfort zone
Right.
and embracing the unknown.
Precisely. Another valuable practice is to engage in thoughtful conversations with people who hold different viewpoints than your own. This can help you expand your understanding of the world and challenge your own biases.
That's a great reminder. It's easy to get caught up in our own echo chambers, especially in today's world of personalized algorithms.
And
News feed.
actively seeking out diverse perspectives can be incredibly enriching and eye-opening. It helps you develop a more nuanced and well-rounded understanding of complex issues.
Now, as we approach the end of our deep dive, I'd love to leave our listener with a thought-provoking question to ponder. If you were to design a barefoot-inspired system for your own work or life, what would be the one essential rule or guideline you'd include to avoid the pitfalls we've discussed?
That's a fantastic question. After considering all the potential downsides and mitigation strategies, for me, the most crucial guideline would be to always prioritize reflection and continuous learning.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you tell us why you chose that one?
Because in a barefoot environment where agility and adaptability are paramount, it's easy to get caught up in the momentum of doing, reacting, and constantly pivoting. But without regular pauses for reflection, we risk making decisions without fully understanding their implications or learning from our experiences.
That's so true. It's like running a marathon without ever stopping to check your pace or adjust your course. You might reach the finish line, but you might also end up exhausted and off track.
Exactly. Regular reflection allows you to step back, assess your progress,
Yes.
identify areas for improvement, and ensure that your barefoot approach is truly serving your goals and values.
I love that. It's about finding that balance between action and contemplation, between doing and being.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that barefoot cognition isn't a destination, it's a journey of continuous learning and growth.
That's such a powerful reminder for all of us. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and work that we forget to pause and reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it.
It's essential to cultivate that habit of introspection, of asking ourselves, is this approach still serving me well? What have I learned from this experience? How can I adapt and improve?
So to our listener, as you consider incorporating some of these barefoot principles into your own life, remember that it's not about blindly following a set of rules or mimicking someone else's approach. It's about finding what works best for you, your unique context, and your aspirations.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. Embrace the experimentation, the learning process, and the inevitable stumbles along the way. That's where the real growth happens.
Beautifully said. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into barefoot cognition. We hope you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking.
If there's one thing we hope you take away from this, it's this. Stay curious, stay open, and never stop learning.
And remember, even though we've reached the end of this particular deep dive, your own exploration of barefoot cognition is just beginning.
So go out there, experiment, reflect, and see where this path leads you. You might be amazed at what you discover.
Until next time, keep those minds and hearts open and keep diving deep.